Hello, and welcome again to another edition of this study from Scripture of questions that were asked by Jesus. To individuals, to groups of people, these are from the passages of Scripture, questions that Jesus posed to individuals. We've been looking at a number of them and are continuing to do so under the impression that perhaps Jesus would even ask us one of these questions, and looking at the responses of others, kind of evaluating maybe how we would respond. So I'm glad you're joining with us. If you take a couple of seconds just to let us know you're participating in this, we would greatly appreciate that. There's an opportunity if you have any questions about the congregation or some of the things from Scripture or some of the questions that Jesus asked, we will do our best, not just to get back to you, but to help you with the questions that you might have. But glad that you have joined us for this session. A number of other sessions are listed there, as well as some other studies, but just very glad that you are part of this one. The question that we're going to look at today that Jesus asked comes near the end of John's Gospel, John chapter 21. John chapter 21 begins with the disciples fishing. A few of them are, and it's not been a good night. And so they're getting ready to come in for the day, and yet someone on the shore reminds them that, hey guys, why don't you try there? Jesus had done this before and didn't seem to connect even this time until they threw the net overboard. A number of fish were hauled in, and John mentions to Peter, hey Peter, that's the Lord up there. And Peter puts on his outer garment, jumps in the water, swims, the boat follows it, and Jesus says, bring some of the fish, guys. We'll have some breakfast, even though in John chapter 21, verses 9 through 11, Jesus is already preparing breakfast. And the question comes after this breakfast with some of the disciples, specifically for Simon Peter. So in verse 15 of John chapter 21, here's what we see concerning this question, or if you will, questions, that Jesus presented to Peter. After they'd eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. And Jesus replied, feed my lambs. Second time, Jesus asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Oh, yes, Lord, Peter said to him, you know that I love you. Then tend, take care, shepherd my sheep, he said. A third time, Jesus asked, Simon, son of John, do you really love me? This time Peter was grieved that he'd asked for a third time, do you love me? And so Peter said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And then Jesus says, feed my sheep. Now the question is fairly clear that Jesus asked, do you truly love me? Simon, do you truly love me? And notice that he asked Simon, not Peter. But why do you think Jesus may have asked this question? For years, a number of people have examined this. I don't want to ridicule or put those concepts and those discussions down, but I think most obviously this is a teaching moment, not just for his apostle Peter, but for each of us disciples of Jesus who follow. An incredible teaching moment concerning our love for God and how that is expressed and displayed in our lives. But there are a number of people that look to the concept that Jesus asked this question, and he asked this question 3 times to kind of reinstate Peter, since he had denied him when he had the opportunity to stand up for Jesus before his crucifixion. And maybe it was, but it seems like that had already taken place. The message that the angels gave the ladies who were there at the empty tomb, the angel said, you go and tell his disciples, including Peter. In fact, the passages from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, as well as the Gospel of Luke, remind us that Jesus, after he'd resurrected, he went to visit Peter specifically and even individually. So maybe he wasn't so much reinstated. Another one that people don't often talk about is the fact that Jesus kind of doubt where Peter was. Now again, these are tough because Jesus is asking a question. Jesus knows everything, so he already knows the answer. But was he asking concerned about the commitment that Peter had for him? Or maybe because Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus asked the same question in a sense 3 times because he was providing forgiveness for all 3 of those denials with those 3 affirmations of love to restore that relationship, to reconcile Peter to his Lord. Or maybe, I think, perhaps it was inauguration time for Peter to be a leader among the others who are equals with him, but to lead as Jesus would establish the church that day of Pentecost, and Peter would take that prominent role. A variety of reasons why perhaps Jesus asked this question, some familiar, some a little less familiar, but I certainly would like to have you think about those as we continue, because did Jesus really ask that same question 3 times to Peter? Jesus asked a question of Peter 3 times, but there's a small nuance in the differences, even though the question is pretty much the same. And again, Jesus asked a similar question 3 times. If you're to ask someone a question, why would you repeat the question? I told you not to do that. Why did you do that? I told you not to do that. Why did you do that? I told you not. Why would you repeat the similar, almost the same question 3 times? Maybe you would repeat the question to make sure you heard what the person said. Or maybe you repeat the question because you're not buying the answer. You don't believe what the person's saying in response. Or maybe, just maybe, you're repeating the similar question because you want the person to hear what they're saying. Never will forget an incident with my youngest twin son. A dinosaur had somehow made his way through a bedroom window. And I repeatedly asked this son, did you throw that dinosaur through the window? No. Did you throw that dinosaur through the window? No. I asked 11 times because I'd already heard from his mother that he did, and I wanted to challenge him with that, not just to punish him, but I wanted to make sure I heard what he said, and I didn't believe what he was saying because I knew better, but I wanted him to hear what he was saying because he knew he was lying to his dad. And he knew that lying to his dad, believe it or not, is even worse than throwing a dinosaur through a window. Especially since on the 11th time that I asked him, he finally admitted what he had done. Jesus asked, it seems almost the same question, but this is where the study and the understanding of original language really excites some people and yet bores others. But let me take a moment to go through these 3 rounds of questions from Jesus just to notice the variance in them. In verse 15, Jesus says, Simon, do you love me? And the word that he uses for love in the original language is agape. It's the highest form of love. Total sacrificial surrender. I love you so much, I will do everything for you. You have to do nothing back for me. That's the love that Jesus was asking of Simon. And then he added the phrase, more than these. Now, there's been a debate on what the these represent. Was that the fishing that they had experienced in the business of fishing? Was that a past lifestyle that he was reverting back to, or just simply waiting for Jesus in his next appearance? Was it a question more than these with all things in life? Or some people think it was more than the other disciples. Again, in the original language, the masculine is used, and that would primarily indicate the other disciples. We know that they could see each other during this conversation, whether they were able to overhear things we don't know, but Peter had made some pretty braggadocious stands before all the other disciples previously to Jesus' death and resurrection. Even if everybody else denies you, I will not, Peter claimed. And so maybe, do you really love me more than these guys do? Peter, taken back by the question of Jesus, 3 times repeats the same thing. You know that I love you. And then Jesus says this. He said, feed, provide food for my lambs, the younger sheep, the weaker sheep, the little sheep, the ones who had a greater need. So if you really agape me, Peter, more than these other guys, you will provide nourishment for my little ones who are in need. Second round of questioning, Jesus again asks, do you agape me, Peter? And Peter replies, you know I love you. And then Jesus switches kind of the response to his reply to his question. Then tend, shepherd, take care of my sheep, the older, more mature animals. You protect them. You shepherd them. You lead them, guide them where they need to go. Third round of questioning. Jesus asked Peter, Simon, do you love me? This time he uses the word phileo, the word in the original language of Greek that has a brotherly kind of love, the city of Philadelphia. A companionship, a connection, a great affection for an individual. And Jesus says, Peter, do you phileo me, that kind of really tight brother companion love? Peter, yes, you know I love you. And then Jesus says, feed, provide the nourishment for my sheep. Little lambs first time, sheep second time, and the third time. Nuances there, but why is Jesus doing those things? Does Jesus go back from a lesser, does he let Peter off the hook because you don't have to agape, the highest form of love, you just got to phileo, brotherly love me? Well, the reality, folks, is there's nothing wrong with brotherly love, and the Bible speaks of it repeatedly in the most positive of senses. It appears as if Jesus is saying, if you really love me like that, Peter, then the love's got to go beyond me. It's got to go to others and to what you do on my behalf. That's why you got to take care and feed the lambs and the sheep. Loving me is great, Peter. But do you love me enough that you're going to do the things that I need you to do because you love those people the way that I love those people? I think that's the overall lesson in this for Peter. Remember, Peter struggled with the Gentiles. God had given him a revelation of food that was unclean, and Peter said he wanted nothing to do with it, and God says, I don't say it's unclean, it's not unclean, son. And then he's going into a Gentile home as a Jew, and even reminded Cornelius and his household, you know, I'm not supposed to associate with you guys. And later on in Galatians, he's reminded by Paul, because he's playing favorites in a sense with the Christians who are a Jewish background and less so much with those from a Gentile background. To love as Jesus loved, because we love him with a deep, affectionate, connected, companion, brotherly type love. Maybe that helps you with your take on Peter's response to Jesus' question, do you really love me? Because Peter pretty much says the same thing all 3 times. Lord, you know I have a brotherly, deep down affectionate connection love with you. And again, phileo is not a bad love. And maybe Peter was a little gun-shy because of some braggadocious statements, again, he had made earlier, and he was kind of making sure. Maybe Peter just didn't understand it yet. But notice the phrase that Peter uses each time in his reply to Jesus each time. Lord, you know. Lord, you know. And of all the times that any of us want to be like Peter, I think this is when we are most like Peter. If Jesus were to ask you, do you really love me? I think like Peter, Lord, you know I really do love you. How do we understand that love? Because to love Jesus is one thing, but to love as Jesus loved. Jesus 3 times in the Gospel of Mark reminds all of us, including Peter, that if you love me, you'll do as I command. If you really love me, you will do what I say. If you really love me, then you will obey me. If Jesus were to ask you, do you truly love me, what would you reply? It's a pretty haunting question because he already knows. And again, Jesus said, do you agape me? Not just that you phileo me, that's good. But does it bring about the love of a life that is lived for me? Scripture reminds us that loving God simply means obeying his commands. And folks, the reality is his commands are not too difficult for us. If we really truly love Jesus, are we obeying God? It would appear that love is the primary incentive for obedience, as obedience is truly the proof of our faith in God, and not just how much we trust him, but how much we love him. Do you really love me? God, you know I love you. Then you need to do as I command. You need to obey me. If you really love me. Again, the Apostle John said this, love means living the way God commands us to live. As you've heard it from the very beginning, this is his command, that you and I are to live a life of love. That is the demand, the minimum demand of a disciple in Jesus. Not just to love Jesus. That's kind of easy. But it's to love as Jesus loved. And to love in a way that obeys him as we love others through that life of love that we live. You would think such a simple question with such a simple reply wouldn't be so, maybe not for you, but it is for me, so convicting. Harry, Jesus asked, do you really love me? Lord, you know I love you. How do you think Jesus would answer my reply to him? Or maybe more personally, as you reflect upon this, if Jesus were to ask you, and in a sense he does, do you really love me? Oh, you know everything, God. You know that I love you. What would Jesus reply in regards to your response to his question, do you truly love me? Would he say something like this, as he did in the Gospel of John? I've obeyed my Father's commands, and therefore I remain in his love. In the same way, if you obey my commands, Jesus says, you remain in my love, because you're really my friends. You do what I command you. If you really love me, Terry, then do what I tell you. Live that life of love by obeying me. I know you love me, but just do what I say. Maybe if Jesus asked you that question, maybe that would be your reply, similar to Peter's. I think I would be there, just like Peter. Then maybe Jesus would say to us what he actually did say to Peter. Not just in reminding him of that responsibility of living that life of love, but after he explains to Peter the type of death he'll die, and the same with John that Peter was so concerned about twice, Jesus simply says, Peter, just follow me. Just follow me. I hope this isn't too convicting, but I hope it is a tremendous challenge. That if Jesus were to ask, do you truly love me? Like Peter, like most of us, yes, you know, Lord, I love you. Maybe Jesus would reply, then follow me, obey me, live that life of love. And I hope that you and I can do our best to live that life of love because we truly do love Jesus.